This morning, President Biden issued a letter, a statement to fellow Democrats, written in a way that feels like, from olden times as you would. It's about a 2-page, single-spaced letter. It's very specific, lots of details. But of course, we need to throw it back to just a couple days ago. He had his first sit-down interview, this with George Stephanopoulos, and he asked him, kind of what would it take to get him to step down or step aside even, not even step down from the presidency, but to just step aside from being the nominee in the upcoming election. And of course, here's what he had to say.
And if Chuck Schumer and Hakeem Jeffries and Nancy Pelosi come down and say, we're worried that if you stay in the race, we're going to lose the House and the Senate, how will you respond?
I go into detail with them. I've spoken to all of them in detail, including Jim Clyburn. Every one of them. They all said I should stay in the race. Stay in the race. None of the people said I should leave.
But if they do?
Well, it's like, they're not going to do that.
You sure?
Well, yeah, I'm sure. Look, I mean, if the Lord Almighty came down and said, Joe, get out of the race, I get out of the race, the Lord Almighty's not coming down.
The Lord Almighty is not coming down, has not made an appearance for Joe Biden to say, get out of the race. And again, double down on that. I mean, this came out on X this morning. It reads from Joseph R. Biden Jr. Fellow Democrats, now that you've returned from the July 4th recess, I want you to know that despite all the speculation in the press and elsewhere, I am firmly committed to staying in this race, to running this race to the end, and to beating Donald Trump. I have had extensive conversations with the leadership of the party, elected officials, rank and file members, and most importantly, Democratic voters over the past 10 days or so. You skip forward a little bit. He goes, I wouldn't be running again if I did not absolutely believe I was the best person to beat Donald Trump in 2024. Democratic nomination process, and the voters have spoken clearly and decisively. Skip forward a little bit more. He says, do we now just say this process doesn't matter? That voters don't have a say? So now, flipping it on the Democratic Party, saying, you know what, you can't do this. And I predicted this a few weeks ago when all of it started to happen, and really even the original conversation, which was, do I think there's a chance he's not the nominee? Of course, I do think there's a chance. However, this guy didn't work 80 years to become the president of the United States to then just give up. It's pretty intense. It's about 2 full pages long, going over the details pretty much of why he should still be considered, Joe Biden should be considered the nominee, and why he's not going anywhere. Again, he hasn't really even moved at all from this stance. So I don't think it's that shocking that he would do this. When you have to make those kind of statements, things are clearly rough and the pressure is mounting.
I think that's precisely correct. And I think if you look at Joe Biden, if you look at his history over his 60 to 70 year career in politics, he's a very stubborn individual, and he doesn't look kindly upon contrary advice. Secondly, of course, I think his family is firmly committed to keeping him in this race, in part because if he decides to leave the presidential race, then the pressure will become very, very heavy on him to actually resign from the presidency. Because if he's not competent to run for president, then the question becomes, is he competent to be president?
Yeah, for another 7 months. Jordan, what are your thoughts when you see this letter?
I see this letter as desperation, as, listen, I've got the delegates under DNC rules, which you can get into. Those delegates are bound unless there was some kind of revolt. And when we look at a revolt, could all those delegates actually be dispelled from the Democrat National Convention if they were to vote for someone else other than Joe Biden, because they are bound delegates? Now, the DNC works differently, Logan, than the RNC, so we're digging into those rules. But I think that's what he's building up to, is by the time I get to my convention in August, you need to trust me. Stop hurting the campaign, or Donald Trump is going to win the election. So what does it tell me, Logan? One, their internal polls show them sinking in the key demographics. I would think that is women, probably 35 and over, especially with kids. You've got Black Americans, especially Black American males, and Hispanic voters. So if you see more of the same from President Biden, you're going to get more of these letters. But I think Logan thinks, well, I'm going into the convention and I've got those bound delegates. And let me tell you what's happening. Very smart Democrat attorneys are looking for every loophole possible to unbound those delegates. I have no doubt that is happening as we speak.
Yeah, it is one of those very interesting times in American politics. I don't think we've lived through this necessarily, where you've had such a revolt. You even had some of the major fundraisers this weekend. We saw people like Abigail Disney and a few of these others who are major Democrat fundraisers, people that would give millions and millions of dollars, who are now saying, I'm not giving until you've replaced Joe Biden, and making statements like he will lose. And I think that is an interesting thing too, because I still think you're going to have a large percentage of the country that is going to vote for President Biden and President Trump. We know where 48% of this probably lands. I don't think that changes, but it does change it a bit more when you have a weak candidate coming through.
Right, because on election day, sometimes the lines get long. I mean, my last primary that I voted in, it was an hour and a half line, and there were 3 other precincts within a mile of me, but I had to go to that one. That was just for a primary. So for a general election, if you're not really excited about your candidate, you had work that day, and your kid's sick, are you going to figure out how to spend that hour plus time, or are you going to wake up at 5 a.m. to be the first one to vote? I mean, that's what people need to feel if a candidate is going to get elected. And I think the MAGA voters will be those first voters in line. And if they had to work a hard day, they're going to make sure that they get inside to vote before they close the doors. So he's got a strong base right now, President Trump. And he's building on this new base, which believes that Biden is just not competent and should not have his hands near the nuclear code or directing our military, especially when he forgot that when he withdrew from Afghanistan, no Americans died. 13 of our bravest, strongest young Americans died in that botched withdrawal. So when you see that again, and a letter like this, Logan, it just smacks of desperation. I think that the money problem is probably gigantic in the Biden team. I've been on campaigns like this. When you hit it doesn't mean you can't come back. It's happened before. But when you hit a big slope like this, Logan, what you have to really watch out for is the entire team either going on a volunteer basis or being let go because they can't afford to live on a volunteer basis. So I would love to know how bad Joe Biden's fundraising is right now. But I have to tell you, I bet it's horrendous because the Hollywood crowd has left him.
Yeah, they're starting to turn on him. And before I want to hear Harry's thoughts on this as well, I want you to hear even from people from maybe the left that have some experience with this. This is from David Axelrod just this past weekend on CNN, asking about how President Biden can even recover. Let's take a listen.
His psyche is that he can beat anybody and any long odds. What he can't beat is Father Time, and that's really the concern here. It's not about his record. Every time he's asked about whether he can do the job until he's closer to 90 than 80, he says, well, look at what I did the last 4 years. That's just not the way it works.
Harry, I'll get your thoughts on that.
Well, I think David Axelrod is absolutely correct. And I would also point out that the publicly available evidence suggests that Biden is facing an accelerating decline in mental acuity, which he can no longer hide. Having said that, there's a lot of inertia with respect to the Biden campaign. And some of this inertia, I think, comes from the fact that Kamala Harris, who might be the logical replacement, is equally unpopular, right, or if not equally, perhaps she's in worse shape. Mm-hmm. And so Alan Lichtman, who's a historian who has accurately predicted presidential elections 9 out of the last 10 times, he has suggested that the Democrats are best off sticking with Biden, however poor a candidate he may be. And he may indeed be right. Yeah. And so I think the Democrats they face a conundrum, a dilemma. Should Biden stay or go? And I think if you look at the data is equally bad.
Yeah, I think that actually brings a good point, especially as President Trump is about to make his announcement probably in the next week or so of who his vice presidential running mate will be. That, historically, it maybe didn't matter, but when you have presidents that are in their late 70s, early 80s, the vice president starts to become much more important, and they made a decision to go with Kamala Harris, and that may have backfired on them because there could have been an easy path to someone stepping in who, again, was more popular, was more liked, but you have someone who has been treated even in the liberal press, as someone a bit of a laughingstock. Whether you agree with that or not, she's the butt of the joke a lot of the time, just on the way she speaks or the laughing or the performance. So now you have a situation where they can't go to their logical vice presidential pick, who's their vice president, who could step in because she's not that popular. However, it is a nightmare if they decide to go with somebody else. But then Jordan, that same thing happens now for President Trump. That's why this is probably the most important vice presidential pick in our lifetime.
Absolutely, because President Trump only has one term. So whoever gets that VP nod next week, if President Trump is to win the election, they will be running for president in 2 years. I mean, think about that. They will have to start their campaign for president in 2 years. And also, Logan, I think when you talk about these issues, just got a little echo there. When you talk about these issues of who will vote, how they can vote, and the importance of this, I think what we have to get down to is this. This is all on the Democrats. They always call us the chaos conservatives. Who's in chaos this summer? We have a candidate who's been going through all these court trials, and he's been able to make a campaign work. He's in his 70s. He's able to go from a courtroom for 6 hours in New York City and do a fundraiser, a speech, and an interview on television before he starts again at 5 a.m. the next day. That's the kind of people presidents need to be. They're kind of they have extra human powers.
Yeah, I think that's right. When you have these situations occur, and like you said, the chaos of this is that the party, even with Donald Trump's, the craziness surrounding him, all of the court cases, everything's happened. If anything, you've had a party more unified than ever behind President Trump, and the opposite now happening just due to concerns of somebody's health and physical fitness.